Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
From the creators of the popular science show with millions of YouTube subscribers comes the Minute Earth podcast. Every episode of the show dives deep into a science question you might not even know you had. But once you hear the answer, you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Why do rivers curve? Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms? And why do so many more kids need glasses now than they used to? Spoiler alert, it isn't screen time. Our team of scientists digs into the research and breaks it down into a short, entertaining explanation, jam-packed with science facts and terrible puns. Subscribe to Minute Earth wherever you like to listen.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 556, The Americans Have Landed. Last time, as the main landings of Torch took place during the early hours of November 8, 1942, two special operations were carried out at the Center and Eastern Task Force's locations. Operations Terminal and Reservists were to capture and hold the port facilities at Algiers and Oran, respectively. Yet both failed. Allied troops were killed or captured. Oran's port would be wrecked, but not Algiers, as the Vichy troops there had been too busy attacking Lieutenant Colonel Swenson and his men. Still, the main landings went on as scheduled, more or less. The Eastern Task Force, which would take Algiers, was under the command of Vice Admiral Burrow, Royal Navy, of 33 transports, carrying just over 32,000 men, of which some 22,000 were British. Having said that, U.S. Major General Charles Ryder was in command of the ground troops. Two landings would take place west of Algiers, labeled Apples and Beer, and to the east, one landing, designated Charlie. From left to right, the 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers, and 5th Battalion, Northamptonshire Regiment landed at beaches Apples Green and Apples White, furthest west. They came ashore at 1 a.m., November 8th. And it would be the 2nd Lancashire Fusiliers, west of everyone, that would head inland to take Blida Airfield. Not that was part of the plan at first. Meanwhile, the 5th Battalion, Northamptonshire, which had landed east of the Lancashire Fusiliers, would start to head east, making for Algiers. The 36th Brigade Group was held in reserve. These men comprised the 11th Brigade Group overall and would be the only large British formation to take place in the Torch landings. Again, this needed to be perceived as an American enterprise, thus the American flag was carried by American troops as they approached the capital. As the men of the 11th Brigade Group moved out, whether heading east or south, they captured towns and bridges on the way, including a radio station and barracks, with very shocked-looking French soldiers inside. Meanwhile, but still west of Algiers, Colonel John O'Daniel and his integrated 168th RCT of 4,000 Americans and 1,000 British troops landed at 1 a.m. at Beer White, 12 miles or 19 kilometers closer to the port city. With the 168th Integrated was a part of No. 1 Commando, which went ashore first. As for the rest of No. 1 and all of No. 6 Commando, those forces landed even further east, closer to the town designated Beer Red, which was about 6 miles northwest of Algiers. As they were coming ashore just west of a fort named Fort Dupere, it was their job to secure this location. But between mechanical problems and rough seas, they would not make landfall until 8:15 a.m., and try as the commandos might, the men inside Fort Dupere continued to resist. That is, until 8 Royal Navy Albacores flew over a few times, and each time dropped bombs. as this contest played itself out just south-southwest of Fort Dupaire at Lamberidi on Algiers' western edge, the 1st Battalion of the 168th RTC had arrived, but was being held up by stiff resistance. And as this resistance continued, which could not be allowed to throw off the larger timetable, Regimental Commander Lieutenant Colonel Edward Doyle led a 25-man team around this fighting and entered Algiers. Due to speed and stealth, they were able to reach the People's Palace at 3 p.m. and occupy it. But wanting to do more to cripple the capital, Doyle moved on, as he wanted to make a prisoner of the German consul who was hiding at the police station. But as they approached, a French sniper killed Doyle. In time, his wife would be informed of his death by the War Department. Lieutenant Colonel Edward J. Doyle is buried in Carthage, Tunisia. As Algiers was filled with pro-Allied and pro-Vichy officers alike, General Charles Mast ordered his troops, those who were listening to him, to stand down. He even went to the beaches to meet and greet Colonel O'Daniel's 168th RCT. He had brought local transport to speed up the men of the 11th Brigade Group. Next, Mast requested/suggested that Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Trevor of No. 1 Commando take Blyde Airfield, again to the south. Mast even provided them with French vehicles. Trevor and company arrived at the airfield at 9 a.m., and Mast had even called ahead, telling the colonel there to stand down, and the colonel complied. That is, until General Louis-Marie Coultz had relieved Mast and replaced him with another. Now the colonel at the airfield, Montrelet, was to resist the Allies with all his might. But seeing which way the wind was blowing, allowed the Allies to land planes at his airfield, but they were not allowed to take off again to attack French positions. It was a compromise the Allies could live with, for now, as it meant that the French could not use this airstrip to attack the Allies. To the east of Algiers, just like to the west, the Americans came ashore and British and American commandos landed as well, but in between the Americans and the port city, acting as a shield. Colonel Benjamin Caffey Jr.'s 39th RCT would then head west to close in on Algiers from the east. But recalling the last episode, Colonel Caffey was also to have had the 39th Infantry Regiment commanded by Major Walter Oakes and his highly trained men aboard the Thomas Stone, which had been damaged by Vichy forces. But despite the missing battalion, the remainder of Caffey's command landed with 198 British and 114 commandos. They landed at points designated Charlie Red, Green, and Blue at 1:30 a.m. Not that their landings did not have moments of intensity. As the transports had come to a point about 4,000 yards from the beaches, the French searchlights and then artillery located them. The French guns opened up, but the nearby British destroyers Cowdrey and Zeppelin knocked out the searchlights, which made the guns at the battery go silent. To the immediate west or right of the Allied commandos' landing location was the town of Jean Bart, and then Fort d'Estrée and the now silent Battery du Lazaret. The commandos made short work of occupying the town and now controlled the approaches to the two military facilities, but those inside would not surrender in either one. As for the men of Caffey's 39th RCT, its 3rd Battalion double-timed it west along the coast and reached Fort Doulou halfway to Algiers city center. But that was as far as they got, for French infantry and 3 tanks stopped their progress. Yet, in a way, this worked out for the Allies, as the 1st Battalion of the 39th RCT, but missing their heavy equipment, as it was still stuck in the sand, traveled a more southern parallel track as the 3rd Battalion. Though their journey was a bit longer, it brought them to the Maison Blanche airfield, south by southeast of where the 3rd Battalion was being stalled by those 3 tanks and infantry. The men got there by 6:15 a.m. and, like their comrades, were also met by tanks and infantry. But here, the tanks fired a few rounds and then withdrew. This allowed Allied aircraft to begin landing at that airfield at 8:30 a.m. Like at the other airfield, the details, like here the tanks suddenly withdrawing, was unimportant. The airbase was now an Allied possession. Back to the number 1 commandos still outside Fort Thestre, the second of the 3 locations along the coast that the commandos were trying to take early on, the destroyer Zetlin moved in and started an hour-long bombardment of the fort and the battery, starting at 10:30 a.m. Then the formidables Albacores and the cruiser Bermuda moved in and attacked starting at 2:30 p.m. This was too much for the garrison men. The commandos captured the Batterie du Lazaret and 50 prisoners, but they didn't capture the fort in between the city and the battery. That stayed defiant, which brought on its own problems. That being the Luftwaffe. At dusk, 50 Ju-88s, 6 He-111s, and 14 Italian S-79 torpedo bombers showed up and attacked the Allied ships nearby. The vessels fired back, to be sure. Allied aircraft did what they could, but by the time the Axis Air Force left, having lost 6 of their own, the destroyer Cowdrey was hit by bombs, and the transport Leedstown had been torpedoed, leaving 8 of her crew killed, with 14 more wounded. This was the Allies' greatest fear, that the objectives of this operation would not be met in time, and thus leaving the men open to attack by German air power mid-stride. But it could have been worse. The invasion commander, Major General Ryder, had come ashore at 9 a.m. to the west of Algiers. Traveling with some of his men, by evening, the 5th Northamptonshire and a part of the 1st Battalion East Surreys had reached the edge of Algiers. Clearly, no matter what happened next, it would end with the Allies controlling the city. Admiral Darlan recognized this, and thus General of the Corps Juin reached out to the enemy, saying he wanted to negotiate. The rather lenient terms were reached, and at 8 p.m., the Americans, remember the PR value, took control of Algiers. But the devil was in the details. First, the Americans were relying on the French civil service to continue functioning, in part meaning keeping the locals calm, and that Darlan had stressed this in the truce. This truce was only for Algiers. Still, he would meet the Eastern Task Force Command at the port during dawn the next day. Meanwhile, to the west, the Central Task Force had started off with the disastrous Operation Reservist. Several items made this Allied bloodbath possible. With a population of 200,000, Oran was the second largest city of Algeria. Thus, the 40,000 Allied troops approaching would have to deal with the 16,000-plus division of Oran, plus 45 fortified coastal guns with 6 more guns 20 miles further east at Arzew, and the 3 nearby air bases that had about 100 planes, all kinds. As we saw last time, Operation Reservist would hopefully secure the port facilities in a way making much of Oran's defenses meaningless. But this did not happen. Between the escorts, Walney and Hartland being unarmed sloops and not destroyers, French guns delivered death to them on a massive scale, and those few that did land surrendered hours later. To be sure, there were plenty of Americans who strenuously opposed reservists, like U.S. Rear Admiral Andrew Bennett, who would take command of Oran after it was seized, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark, a 3rd Admiral, and Major General Orlando Ward, whose men would be the ones landing. But on the other side of the tally was Eisenhower, or rather Torch Deputy Naval Chief Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who Ike had to listen to, but the one who really pushed it was General Mark Clark. Thus, it moved forward, right under the guns of the French. And when the Walney and Heartland were a mere 100 yards away, French destroyers and the gun decks on submarines opened fire. Walney's superstructure was reduced to splinters. Aboard Heartland, the fire slaughtered all of the gun crews that were topside. The result? The Heartland was abandoned at 4:10 a.m. The Walney exploded at 4:45 a.m. The geography around the city of Oran was not for the faint of heart, especially if attacking it, and that was the order of the day. The Center Task Force's 40,000 men would come in, and besides the French defenses already mentioned, rugged coastline had heights to the west and east of the city, and just southwest of the city was a 25-mile-long salt lake basin called Sebka de Oran. Like with the Eastern Task Force, the Center Task Force would land troops to both the east and west of the target city of Oran. And we've already seen the failure of Operation Reservist. What came next was simply overkill for political reasons and ego. Just outside the southern edge of Oran is the La Senia airfield, and about 7 miles further south of that is the Tarafui airfield, and both of these were to be captured on D-Day by M3 Stuart tanks of Task Force Green, which would land about 16 miles or 25 kilometers to the west of Oran at Beach X. This was designated Operation Villain. But General Mark Clark, fearing the British would snatch up all uncommitted units, also wanted a parachute drop at the airfield to get there first before the tanks. Putting aside the waste of resources, the who's who of those who thought Operation Villain was unimportant was impressive. First, the U.S. Army planners of Torch felt that Villain made no material difference, and Ike was far from impressed. But General Mark Clark pushed for it, and so he got it. Meanwhile, Colonel William Bentley, U.S. Air Force, was chosen as Villain's commander, so he kept his mouth shut. The men of the Parachute Task Force dropping down would be Lieutenant Colonel Edson Raff's 556 men, 2nd Battalion, 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment. They would be taken by 39 C-47 Skytrains of the U.S. Army Air Force 60th Troop Carrier Group. For the British, who opposed this, they felt that these men and these planes should have been saved for Tunisia. And then it got worse. Bentley's staff created two plans, Plan Peace and Plan War. One day before D-Day, which plan was to be executed would be decided. If all was going well with the invasion and or the French were complying, then Plan Peace would be ordered. The parachutists would drop over La Senia airfield during the day of D-Day and take up positions. If, for whatever reason, Plan War was chosen, the men would leave Britain hours earlier and drop for the further south Tarfui airfield, expecting to fight. Either way, this was going to be the longest parachute drop of the war by an airborne arm that had no combat experience. What could go wrong? On November 7th, the word was given. Plan Peace. The planes took off from their Cornwall airfields, but in the dark and fog and radio failures, mistakes started to be made. Oh, and during the flight, Allied Front Headquarters decided to change the plan from peace to war, but didn't tell or couldn't tell the parachutists this. As the planes got closer to Algeria, after flying around occupied France and over Franco-Spain, an Allied ship off Oran was supposed to guide the transports in, using a homing signal broadcast at 440 kilocycles. But the ship was broadcasting at 460 kilocycles, despite their orders. Thus, another chance to warn the men of the change in plans did not happen. But when they crossed the mountains to the west of Oran, the pilots truly became lost. The darkness did the rest, helping to scatter some of the aircraft. 2 of them landed in French Morocco. 1 gave up and went to Gibraltar. Another dropped its passengers over Spanish Morocco. Another 3 landed in Spanish Morocco. 67 of these men were interned by Franco Spain. The last plane with these 3 saw the Spanish troops on the ground and regained speed and height, flying away. This left the remaining 32 C-47s to reach Algeria at 6 a.m. on D-Day. But it only went marginally better for them. 12 C-47s let their men out, including RAF, at 20 miles or 32 kilometers west of the airfields, on the other end of the Salt Lake. They landed, looked around, and started hiking towards La Siena. Meanwhile, Colonel Bentley's C-47, the commander of Villain, flew over La Siena and was shot at by French AA fire. Clearly, Operation Peace was a bust. In time, Bentley's plane with 2 other C-47s would be forced down near Oran and captured. The rest were dropped, like the others, near the far end of the Salt Lake at 8:30 a.m. Meanwhile, the ground forces had already made landfall after some unexpected turns. Combat Command B of the U.S. 1st Armored Division would land at Beach X, furthest west, at Mursa Bau Zadar. See the map. They would secure the beach and then head south to take the airfield at Lumel, on the northwest corner of the Salt Lake. They would then take the road east that went just above the Salt Lake towards La Siena and Tarfarawi airfields with their 20 Stuart light tanks. As they would first be operating in the dark, a method of identification was needed. But being Americans, they kept it simple. The Challenger would cry out, "Hi-ho, Silver!" and the answer had better be, "Away!" or guns would start to go off. Not that the landings of Combat Command B went smoothly. Between running into a Vichy convoy and then sandbars, literally, delays occurred. But the men eventually got ashore and got moving. Soon after 9 a.m., the armored green flying column reached and secured Lumel. Then they started heading east, making for the airfields. Still west of Oran, but closer, only some 8 miles from the port city, Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt Jr., commander of 26 RCT, was heading for the Les Andelus, or Beach Y, on his map. At 11:20 p.m., November 7th, his men started loading onto 45 Royal Navy crewed landing craft. At 11:45 p.m., the landing craft started making the 6-mile journey to shore, which is when things started going wrong. Predating a Monty Python-esque scene, the first 3 LCMs ran aground. Thinking this was the land, they began to unload their heavy equipment, which went forward a few feet and then disappeared underwater. Fortunately, the other landings went better. At 1:38 a.m., now November 8th, 8 LCPRs landed 26 RCT's second wave successfully, which is when, far from the beaches, back on the ocean liner that he was on, Major General Terry Allen, commander of the 1st Infantry Division, decided to say, "Boys, I thought you'd like to know our first 2 waves landed without opposition." He was ignoring the sandbars. And then he said, "I just sent a signal to the French to put in their first team," meaning their best. Morale is one thing, to be sure, but it's this weighing the enemy less mighty than he seemed attitude that the British hoped to disabuse the Americans of. They hadn't faced anyone, certainly the Germans, yet. By 5 a.m., though, 2,670 men and 33 vehicles were unloaded on the green beaches. As the failed Operation Reservist had alerted the French at Oran, at 5:15 a.m., French destroyers Typhon, Tramontane, and Tornade left the harbor. They soon engaged HMS Aurora, a cruiser. The British ship returned fire, sinking the Tramontane and chasing away the Tornade, which was eventually beached. While this was going on, the French sloop La Surprise crept up on the transport Langibby Castle, which was near Roosevelt Jr.'s beach, and opened fire. Fortunately, the destroyer HMS Brilliant rushed up and clashed with La Surprise. This went on for over an hour, and at 7:15 a.m., the French vessel blew up and went under. Closer to Oran, the coastal artillery started to open up an hour later, and the guns at Fort du Santon to the northwest of Oran, which had 6 75mm guns, hit the picked-on already Langibby Castle more than once. This was at 9:17 a.m., and the castle backed away out of range. To wit, the coastal guns now aimed at another transport at 10:50 a.m., but the HMS Rodney rushed up and fired on the guns. It wasn't clear at the time if any of the French guns were actually hit, but they went silent, which was good enough. At 11:37 a.m., the British cruisers Aurora and Jamaica moved in and chased the lone Typhoon back into port, which was joined by a fourth French ship that had recently arrived. But it would be to the east of Oran that the largest contingent of troops would make landfall. Coming ashore at Gulf d'Azur, Major General Terry Allen had most of his U.S. 1st Infantry Division, made up of the 16th and 18th RCTs, led by Colonel Henry Cheadle and Colonel Frank Greer, respectively. Also coming ashore was a unit of Lieutenant Colonel William Darby's 1st Rangers and Task Force Red, comprised of many of the men of Combat Command B, led by Brigadier General Lunsford Oliver. By now, the GIs on board couldn't wait to get ashore. They were tired of their British hosts, mostly of their food, so spent most of their time before disembarking listening to the radio at the Army Notre Dame football game. And yet, despite propaganda leaflets being dropped before Allied aircraft or Allied infantry could get too far inland, the French would respond in a way not hoped for by the Western Allies. Waiting for them was intense AA fire and enemy fighters. The Americans disembarking would soon realize they had it better back on the ship.